craziest part about being a late diagnosed autistic is realising that you fit the full diagnostic criteria the whole time, but nobody realised it. They passed off your autistic traits as anxiety, shyness, bossiness, when really there was more going on. If you don't know me, my name's Ellie. I'm a late diagnosed autistic. I was formally diagnosed this year at the age of 25, and before that I was self-diagnosed. Today I'm going to talk you through the full diagnostic criteria, what it means and how I actually fit it. If you're anything like me, you probably really need examples to understand something, which is why I found videos like this so helpful when I was starting my own autism journey. Because let's be honest, the diagnostic criteria sounds really confusing and might as well be in a different language. I think self-diagnosis is a really important part of the diagnostic process, so when you do actually go and get your assessment, you can confidently understand how your autism affects you and how it presents. Or if you already are diagnosed, this might just help you understand yourself more. If you're new here, make sure you follow me on TikTok at Els Better Life and subscribe. Quick disclaimer that I'm not a professional and everything that I'm talking about is just based on my own experience as a late diagnosed autistic. This is just a tool to help others see their own autistic traits and understand themselves more. With that being said, let's talk about the Autism Diagnostic Manuals. There are two that are mainly used. There's a DSM5, which is mainly used in the US, and you have the ICD-11, which is used in Europe. My diagnosis was actually made using both of these manuals, and for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be using the DSM5 today because I think it'll be a bit more universally applicable. And without starting any debate, I think that both of them manuals say the same thing but in slightly different ways. So let's talk about what the DSM5 actually says about autism. I'm going to summarise it first and then I'll go into detail about each section after. So within the DSM5 for autism, there are two key criteria. There's criteria A and there's criteria B. Criteria A is 3 parts and you need to fit all of them for an autism diagnosis. Those 3 parts are deficits in social and emotional reciprocity, deficits in non-verbal communication used for social interaction, and deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. Then we have part 2, which has 4 parts, but you only need to fit 2 out of 4 then parts along with criteria A to fit the criteria. Those 4 categories are 1, stereotypes or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, 2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routine, or ritualized patterns of verbal and non-verbal behaviour. 3 is highly restricted interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, and number 4, hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Oh, that was a mouthful. Autism is a neurodevelopmental condition, so the DSM-5 also states that these symptoms must appear in the early stages of development, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacity, or may be masked by learned strategies later in life. Symptoms must also cause clinically significant impairment and can't just be trivial or occasional struggles. And finally, these symptoms can't be better explained by intellectual disability. Now that you understand what the criteria says, let's understand what it actually means, because again, it isn't in the clearest English. And of course, I had to approach this in the most autistic way possible by creating a spreadsheet. Future Ellie here, I decided to make a spreadsheet that you could use yourself. It's all split up by category like how I've done it for my spreadsheet, and there's about 50 different examples and prompts that you can use to fill in your own autistic traits. I think this will be a really big help to any of you guys who are in the process of trying to understand yourself or see how you fit the criteria. So of course you can do this alongside me. There's a link for it in the description. I think having a visual aid is actually really important because at some stage or another, most autistics are going to struggle with imposter syndrome, especially if you are late diagnosed or late realised as an autistic. So whenever this happens or you feel like you are making up your autistic traits, because surely somebody would have recognised them sooner, right? You can look at that list of traits and how you fit the criteria and see that these are actual real struggles, and it'll stop your imposter syndrome almost instantly. If we look at mine, it's also worth noting that some categories are going to be more detailed than other categories, and that is completely fine. We all experience our autistic struggles in different ways, but as long as you fit the full diagnostic criteria, it doesn't matter how them autistic traits present, and that is why autism is a spectrum. It doesn't make either one of us more or less autistic. So let's discuss criteria A in a bit more detail. As I mentioned before, the first section in this criteria is called deficits in social and emotional reciprocity. Let's call it A1. This describes how an autistic person struggles to communicate with others in social situations. The DSM-5 gives a few examples of how this could present, but it's worth noting here that these are not an extensive list of examples, so do not take this criteria too literally and think, oh, my struggle doesn't fit under this criteria. As long as it is a difficulty within this section, then you can list it regardless of whether it's shown in the DSM-5 or not. The first example the DSM-5 gives is abnormal social approach, but what does that actually mean? For me, that was just appearing noticeably different than my peers. I was always advanced for my age, and my struggles were always blamed on being too advanced or too clever to understand the other children. Where they would run up to each other and play, I would just stand back and observe how they interacted with each other. I was always confused by how easy other children found talking to each other, because for me it took so much conscious processing. My parents even noticed this, and at the age of around 5, they enrolled me into a drama class to teach me how to talk to other children, and so that I would become more confident. But in their eyes, I was just shy, never realising that there was actually something more that was going on. This social approach has actually been very common throughout my life, where I've always observed other people's behaviour before actually joining in on any interactions. Another example the DSM-5 gives for A1 is failure of normal back and forth conversation. Something I recently learned, which makes a lot of sense, is that allistics actually have a completely different approach to conversations. They treat it more like a game of tennis, where one person will say a sentence, then they'll pass it over to the other who will say a sentence, who will pass it over to the other. Whereas for me, as an autistic, and I know a lot of other autistics are the same, I actually speak in paragraphs. I give all of the detail on one subject before I let the other person move on, and maybe that's why I've always been known as an oversharer. I don't have that instinctive understanding of how a conversation should look. When should I be asking questions? When should I stop talking? When should I start talking? And I also hate small talk, which is very common in autistics too. For me, it just seems completely pointless. I would much rather learn something meaningful about a person than what they had last night for tea. As I've got older and learned to mask more, this has meant that I have to constantly think about whether I'm doing the right thing within a conversation to make sure that I don't seem like I'm being rude or don't care about what the other person has to say. Let me know if you relate to this. The third example given in A1 is a reduced sharing of interests, emotions or affect. For me, I would summarise this as restricting what you are doing or saying within a social interaction because you don't know what is right. For me, I've always been terrified of expressing my opinions and just going along with things and try to seem really positive all the time because I didn't know whether it was socially appropriate to share my emotions. I've also always felt really embarrassed by things, including sharing my special interests or things that I enjoyed in case people found it strange. The last example for A1 is a failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. I feel like I've already discussed this quite a lot in the other examples, but something I haven't touched on yet is selective mutism. I don't know about anybody else, but I've always really struggled responding to social interactions, especially with people I'm not comfortable with. It's like my brain can't quite connect to my mouth, and I want to say something, but the words don't just come out, and I just end up looking really, really silly because I'm just staring at them like this and I just can't talk, or just end up saying something that doesn't make sense at all. As a result, in social situations, I've always clung to somebody that I felt comfortable with to do all the talking for me, and so that I can more easily understand what the norms of that communication should be. Moving on to criteria A2, which describes deficits in non-verbal communication used for social interaction. And by non-verbal communication, it means any type of communication other than speech. Again, you do not need to fit into all of these examples. These are just guidance on how the traits could present. The DSM-5 gives the example of poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication. This is basically describing the relationship between what you say and how you say it. Do you find it easy to say the things you want to say while showing how you actually feel? I've always struggled to make things come across the way that I mean them, like asking somebody a question and then being offended by it or thinking I'm being rude because I didn't quite get the tone of voice or my expressions right for that situation, or seeming bored when somebody's talking to me because I wasn't making the right expressions. The next example is abnormalities in eye contact and body language. I think especially with this one, it's important not to take this too literally. I used to think that I couldn't be autistic because I could make eye contact, but it is more about how that thing makes you feel than how it looks from the outside, and that is where masking comes in, because you may feel like you need to make eye contact and you know that it's important, but it might make you feel like somebody's staring into your soul like it always has for me, or you might struggle with knowing how much eye contact is appropriate. If these are things that you relate to, then that is a deficit. Other examples of body language could be facial expressions, how you sit, how you carry yourself. Ask yourself whether any of these things come naturally or whether you have to consciously think about doing them. I've always been preoccupied with how I appear to others for this reason. Am I smiling enough? Am I doing the right facial expressions? Am I standing or walking right? Your tone of voice could also fall under this too. I've always been told in my family that I talk really posh compared to them, and even in my autism assessment, the assessor said that my speech is actually more flat than most people's, and that again is a sign of being autistic. Another example, deficits in understanding and use of gestures. This This is more asking you how you interpret other people's behaviours rather than how you actually behave yourself. So the big question here is, do you automatically understand how other people are feeling, or do you have to consciously read them? I've always been told that I've had a delayed reaction to things, but that was because I was consciously processing every bit of information that I was given so I could understand somebody's intention. Like sarcasm isn't something I instinctively understand. I have to create rules within my head about who to expect that sarcasm from so I can interpret their behaviour and their words correctly. I also get very stressed out by any body language that isn't obvious. So if somebody has a neutral facial expression, I will find it impossible to understand how they're actually feeling. And then the last example is a total lack of expressions and non-verbal communication. I wouldn't say I fall under this example, but it's just trying to say that you don't use or understand facial expressions or non-verbal communication at all, which I'm assuming would apply more to high support needs autistic. Let's move on to criteria A3, which is deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships. So to differentiate from criteria A1 and A2, this isn't about how you interact on a one-off basis, but how these interactions relate to each other long term. The DSM5 gives the example of difficulties adjusting behaviour to variable social contexts. This has always been a big struggle of mine, where I'll know how to talk to somebody in one situation, but as soon as that context or scenario changes, I will be back to square one with them again. For example, at school, I would quite happily help other children and talk to them within the classroom, but the minute that we stepped out onto the playground, because that context changed, it was as if I'd never met them in my life and I went back to not talking to them at all. Or I could be in a situation where I talk to a colleague at work, but then I would bump into them outside of work and either not know what to say because I don't know the social norms of that environment, or I would just pretend that I didn't see them at all so I didn't have to interact. Difficulties in sharing imaginative play. This is an important one because at first I took this too literally. It's not that autistic people don't have an imagination, but the way that they use that imagination is different than non-autistic people. When I was little, I was very imaginative, but it was more like daydreaming and deep thinking than actually playing. I hope that makes sense. The other children would play fairies and role play, but it made absolutely no sense to me, so I would just walk around the playground by myself rather than engaging in these games that I didn't understand. Making friends is the next example, and again, please do not take this too literally. I'm going to say this a million times in this video, but this isn't just about struggling to make friends, but also struggling to keep them friends. As I got older, I found making friends easier because I began copying other people and their interests, but once that relationship became more complex as time went on, that was when I had the biggest struggles, because suddenly there wasn't that easy roadmap and it was so much more complex than just liking the same things. I was masking too often, I was pretending to be somebody that I wasn't. It would become too intense for me to manage, so I'd just run away and jump from friendship group to friendship group. The last example for A3 is absence and interest in peers. Since an early age, I didn't have any motivation to speak to other children, especially the ones my own age, and always gravitated towards older children or adults or towards younger children because I always felt like I wasn't on the same wavelength as them. When I was little, I was always seen as really advanced and mature, but then as I got older, I basically got stuck there and ended up being really immature compared to my peers. Like a lot of autistics, I've also always preferred my own company, but I felt this huge pressure not to be a loner, so I would make friends with all these people that weren't right for me rather than just meeting my own needs, which is something that I really try to do as I've gotten older, because I now understand that as an autistic person, I need that time on my own to process the day and to process my emotions. To reiterate what I said earlier, this is not an extensive list of examples, so if you have other examples that fit into this that I haven't mentioned or that isn't mentioned in the examples of the DSM-5, then do not worry, this will still fall under A3. But I really hope that it helps so far, and let me know in the comments if it does. Let's move on to criteria B. Just to remind you from earlier, you only need to fit 2 out of 4 of these categories in B, along with the categories from A to fit the diagnostic criteria. So criteria B1 is stereotyped or repetitive use of motor movements, use of objects or speech. Repetitive motor movements are probably what you would know as stims, and while they can also be seen in other conditions, for autistic people usually they're used to regulate emotions. The most stereotypical and obvious example that you probably think of is hand flapping, but any repetitive movement that you need to regulate yourself can be classed as an autistic stim. There are also a lot of stims which are a lot more subtle. My biggest ones are nail biting, cracking my knuckles, knuckles, smelling my hands, and using deep pressure on my stomach like big hugs. And before you ask, yes, hugs can actually be a form of stimming if you use them to regulate yourself. If you're interested in hearing more examples of stims, then go to my TikTok where I give loads of examples. The next example within B1 is repetitive use of objects. And another common behaviour in autistics is lining things up, which again is probably one of the most stereotyped ones that you've probably heard of. It's thought that this is done to help autistics understand and make order within the world. It wasn't until I was seeking out my diagnosis at 25 that my mum made me aware that even in my high chair as a baby, I would sit there lining objects up and continue to do that throughout my life. I would go to meals and line sachets up. I would line up my Barbies and My Little Ponies instead of playing with them, and still to this day like objects to be in order. Final example is repetitive use of speech, which can form under something called echolalia, which means that you repeat words and phrases. I remember as a child calling my dad a jerk because I'd heard it on the TV and didn't know what it meant, and another time I told my baby brother to kiss my ass. But it could also be getting stuck on one word or phrase, like counting over and over again, which is something that I also commonly did as a child. Another form of echolalia which nobody talks about enough is actually called internalized echolalia, which is where rather than repeating the words or phrases out loud, they get repeated again and again in your head. Especially as a child, this would keep me up for hours and my brain would keep repeating the same song or phrase again and again. Moving on to criteria B2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualised patterns of verbal and non-verbal behaviour. To summarise, this is asking how flexible you are, and we'll go through the examples. The first one is extreme distress at small changes. I want you to ask yourself how well you cope when things don't go according to plan. If you're anything like me, then you probably have to plan everything within an inch of its life and constantly need to know exactly what's going on. You plan every minute of your day, know exactly where you're going, what you're eating and when you're eating. But if this doesn't go according to plan, it causes extreme stress. I have a huge fear of being late, and if I am, then it can almost guarantee that I'll have a meltdown. Difficulties with transitions is the next example, and this is asking how easily you move from one task to another. Autistic people often struggle with this because it takes us so much longer to process information. I don't know whether this will make sense to anybody else, but I think of this like being stuck in an ice cube. You do one thing like waking up, but then you have to wait until the ice melts before you can move on to anything else. And then you'll be having a bath or a shower and you again get stuck in that same mode where you have to wait for that ice to melt before you can move on to anything else. It's a constant state of freezing and melting in every situation, but if you melt too quickly, you get really stressed and confused by the sudden change. The next one, rigid thinking patterns, which is where you think of everything in black and white. It's either all good or it's all bad. And in me, that's often manifested itself in perfectionism, where I think that I need to do something absolutely perfect or I'm a complete and utter failure if I get anything wrong. And this has also meant that I've procrastinated a lot because I think, what is the point of me doing anything if I can't do it perfect? I can't just go and do one dish if I've got 5 minutes. I would rather wait until I've got 3 hours to do everything. It can also manifest in literal thinking where you think that everything needs to mean exactly what it says. I feel like this is a big reason why so many autistics are late diagnosed, because they hear one example of how autism can present, like not being able to make eye contact, and instantly think that if they don't fit that exact criteria in that exact specific way, then they couldn't possibly be autistic. This is definitely the case for me, so let me know if you relate. Last example, greeting rituals, need to take the same route or eating the same food. These examples are just used to show the ways that autistics may impose routines or structures in their lives, and what some may describe as being particular or fussy. You may need to drink from the same cup every time, eat at the same time every day, or constantly eat the same meals. Many autistics, including myself, do this as a way to create structure in a world which often feels chaotic and uncertain. Any changes to this have always made me feel really stressed. I've self-imposed so many routines in my life to the point that when I was little, I would wake up before my whole family to make sure that my routine and the structure to my day went exactly as I wanted it to go. If you are unsure on any of these, then ask yourself, if I didn't do this or I didn't do that, then how would I cope? If you would not cope well, then again, this is where it will be a deficit. Next, criteria B3, which is highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. The DSM5 gives the example of strong attachment to inanimate objects, which is something I didn't really experience, but what I did experience within D3 was intense obsessive interest. I often joke that autistic people cannot casually do anything, and that's definitely the case for me. If I like something, I have to learn everything about it and become so obsessed with it that I can't think about anything else, which could fall under hyperfocus. I can't watch a film without researching all the actors or enjoy a new topic without having a deep understanding of every aspect. For me, a lot of these things have then become special interests, which for autistics are really important for regulating your nervous system. The most obvious one for me as a child was my obsession with words and reading, where I actually taught myself to read before the age of 3. 3, and by the age of 5 I had the reading age of an 11-year-old. I was literally consumed constantly by books, and this is known as hyperlexia. I'm not sure on the exact statistic, but I think about 80% of children that have hyperlexia are actually autistic. Other special interests for me as a child were My Little Pony and Barbie, High School Musical, and then as I got older, One Direction and Harry Potter, and Harry Potter is still one of my special interests today. And it's not just enjoying a subject. These interests often involve collecting everything possible about that subject, whether it's facts, figures, or physical objects like merchandise. For many, especially those that are late diagnosed, psychology can also become a special interest because you become fixated on understanding yourself and why you were different. But special interest could literally be about any subject in the world. And the final way that I've found that intense interest can present is in phobias. I've had a lifelong phobia of death and a fixation on understanding it. And I'm no expert, but I think the reason for this is because your brain becomes so fixated on them threats that it can't switch off from them. This category of B3 is just about the intensity, so it doesn't matter whether that thing is positive or negative. If it does impact you in that way, then again, that is when you would fit this criteria. The final criteria in the DSM-5 is hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. A crazy thing that I realised since my diagnosis was that sensory issues aren't just struggling with loud noises. They can be anything from not being able to regulate your temperature, not understanding when you're hungry or need the toilet, or of course more obvious sensory ones like sensitivity to noise, light and texture. These things could also present as being very reactive or very underreactive, or even a mixture of the two. For example, I have a hyper response to noises where I can even hear the electricity inside plug sockets and get very stressed out by loud noises. But when it comes to temperature, I'm undersensitive to heat where I can't even tell whether something is hot, to being hypersensitive to cold where it makes me feel physically sick and I come out in hives. I would also always choose texture over taste because I like the taste of most foods, but there are a lot of foods where I cannot stand the texture, like Bueno chocolate. I love the taste of it, but because of the texture it ruins it for me, so I can't eat it. In addition to this, I also get a lot of joy from my senses too, from nature and mountains to fireworks and fairy light. While there are a lot of sensory struggles due to my autism, there are also a lot of amazing sensory experiences which I don't think that I would have if it wasn't for the fact that I experienced my senses in the way that I do as an autistic person. I hope that makes sense. For this section, I would advise that you observe how you experience all of them senses, because the way that you are going to struggle or enjoy them senses is going to be very different from person to person, and you may even say the complete opposite to me. And that is the full diagnostic criteria. I know this has probably been a very long one, so thank you if you have watched for this long. If you have watched until the end, then I really appreciate you watching and I hope that it has helped. So please comment below if it has. Make sure that you subscribe for weekly autism videos. Let me know in the comments what you would like me to talk about next, and like the video if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye!